Hey everyone, and welcome as we continue our study through the New Testament, looking at the New Testament church. And today we are still in First Corinthians. So if you're following along with us, we've been studying the New Testament gospel in chronological order. This is the second year of this study. The last year we did a stint through the four gospels, and now we are running through the rest of the New Testament in chronological order. And so we're in First Corinthians. Today we're going to be in First Corinthians 9, verses 1 through 27. This is going to be a little bit longer one. And I am going to read this one. I typically don't, but this is a really important one, I think. And so um, I know it's going to be lengthy, and I typically don't read the lengthier ones, but I am going to read this one. So, if you want to skip through, if you don't like being read to, but I just think it's really important to go through this one line by line. And it's talking about Paul giving up his rights. And it's something that I think we need to reflect on as Christians, because I've talked about this before, especially in America. We have this idea of like, I have my rights, right? And we do. We're all about freedom. We're all about that. But in Christ, there's a different side to that. And we need to understand that. Yes, we do live in America, and we have lots of freedoms. We have lots of rights. But Paul is going to talk about how, right, it's better to give those rights up in order to win some to Christ. And we need to, as Christians living in America, we need to understand that. We need to understand that sometimes, yes, I have the rights to things. I have rights, and I can do I can do this, I can do what I want to this. But, just because we can do what we want, just because we have the freedom to do, doesn't mean that we should. And so Paul's going to talk about that. And I really think we need to learn this as Christians, because we've sometimes especially we've politicized the Christian side of things sometimes, and we use that to create an attitude that's not a Christian attitude. And so as we look through this, I want you to think about that as we go through it. Before I read, I want to recommend or encourage anyone who hasn't subscribed to our channel to please go ahead and do so, so you can follow along with us, get the alerts, get the notifications when we publish. And if you find this useful, anyone who's watching this, if you find it useful, share it, please. We love to see it grow, continue to spread, and reach more people as we do a little bit deeper dive daily into the Bible. And as always, appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch. So go through this as quickly as I can, but we might stop and hit a few points here before we get into our notes. And so Paul starts and he shifts from 8 talking about food sacrificed to idols and freedoms, and then he shifts to chapter 9. He says, verse 1 here, we're going to do 1 through 27. He says, am I not as free as anyone else? Right? Am I not an apostle? Haven't I seen Jesus our Lord with my own eyes? Isn't it because of my work that you belong to the Lord? Even if others think I'm not an apostle, I certainly am to you. You yourselves are proof that I am and the Lord's apostles. This is my answer to those who question my authority. Don't we have the right to live in your homes and share your meals? Don't we have the right to bring a believing wife with us, or as the other apostles and the Lord's brothers do, as Peter does? How many of y'all knew Peter was married? There's a lot of people that didn't know Peter was married. Or is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to support ourselves? What soldier has to pay his own expenses? What farmer plants a vineyard and doesn't have the right to eat some of its fruit? What shepherd cares for a flock of sheep and isn't allowed to drink some of the milk? Am I expressing merely a human opinion, or does the law say the same thing? For the law of Moses says, you must not muzzle an ox to keep it from eating as it treads out the grain. Was God thinking of only about oxen when he said this? Wasn't he actually speaking to us? Yes, it was written for us so that the one who plows and the one who threshes the grain might both expect a share of the harvest. Since we have planted spiritual seeds among you, aren't we entitled to a harvest of physical food and drink? If you support others who preach to you, shouldn't we have an even greater right to be supported? But we have never used this right. We would rather put up with anything than being an obstacle to the good news about Christ. So he's saying we're not doing this. We don't do this so we don't be an obstacle to Christ. Don't you realize that those who work in the temple get their meals from the offering brought to the temple, and those who serve at the altar get a share of the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord ordered that those who preach the good news should be supported by those who benefit from it. Yet I have never used any of these rights. I am not writing this to suggest that I want to start now. In fact, I would rather die than lose my right to boast about preaching without charge. He's like, look, these are the things I do. I'm not saying I want to do it, because if I did it, I'd lose my right to brag about this, right? That I'm doing this. Yet preaching the good news is not something I can boast about. It's like, I would, but he's like, I can't boast about it. I am compelled by God to do it. How terrible for me if I didn't preach the good news. If I were doing this on my own initiative, I would deserve payment, but I have no choice, for God has given me this sacred trust. What then is my pay? It is the opportunity to preach the good news without charging anyone. That's why I never demand my rights when I preach the good news. Even though I am a free man with no master, I have become a slave to all people to bring many to Christ. When I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew to bring the Jews to Christ. I love this section of verse, and I think this is something we really need to pay attention to, and we really need to act out and learn in our Christian walk. He says, when I was with the Jews, I lived like a Jew so I could bring someone to Christ. When I was with those who followed the Jewish law, I too lived under that law, even though I'm not subject to that law. I did this so that I could bring to Christ those who are under the law. When I'm with the Gentiles who do not follow the Jewish law, I too live apart from the law so I can bring them to Christ. But I do not ignore the law of God. And he said basically saying, I obey the law of Christ, right? So he's saying, look, I still live like a Christian. I'm not sinning, doing things, but I'm not, imposing myself under the law. When I am with those who are weak, I share their weakness, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. Yes, I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. This verse 22 is so important, right? Because and I'm going to stop, and I might not even hit this in the notes, but I want to hit this because I think it's very important to us as Christians, because there's a lot of versions of Christianity out there that's a very arrogant, very self-righteous version. And so when we see someone that's weak, we point out their weakness. We don't share in it, right? And so instead of sharing in their weakness, getting down on their level and helping them out, like Paul is here, like Paul's sharing in their weakness. He's understanding about it. Too often we attack people or when someone's down, we kick them, right? And so we've got to learn that, man, when someone's down, when someone's struggling, we need to get down there with them and struggle with them and help them out, right? And that doesn't mean like if someone's a drug addict that we start taking drugs. What I'm saying is we be understanding. We put ourselves in their shoes. We share their weakness, right? So if you're sharing that, if you're keeping someone else from having to take the full load of the consequences of that, and you're helping them out. And so he says, for I want to bring the weak to Christ. I try to find common ground with everyone, doing everything I can to save some. I do everything to spread the good news and share in its blessings. Don't you realize that in a race everyone runs, but only one person gets the prize? So run to win. All athletes are disciplined in their training. They do it to win a prize that will fade away, but we do it for an eternal prize. So I run with purpose in every step. I am not just shadowboxing. I discipline my body like an athlete, training it to do what it should. Otherwise, and this is important, this is Paul saying this, otherwise I fear that after preaching to others, I might not, or I might be disqualified. Think about that, right? Paul, and I'll talk about this in the end too. Paul, the very person, the great apostle Paul, was like, look, even I have to stay disciplined. I have to discipline my body like an athlete, training it the way it should. Otherwise, I fear that after preaching to others, I might end up being disqualified. He's saying, in the end, like I've got to be careful too, so that I don't fall away. He's saying it's a possibility for him, and so he keeps us aware of that, and we need to understand that. And so Paul here, if we go back to the beginning, Paul offers this rhetorical reply to those who questioned his ministry. Sorry, I can't get the word out. And Paul has rights. He has rights as an apostle, where that were exercised by other apostles, and they included the right to compensation for his work, right? That the right to take a believing wife. He talks about that, but he talks about how he'd rather stay single, and the right to refrain from outside work, devoting himself entirely to the ministry. Right? He had a right to be paid. He had a right to take a wife, and he had a right to refrain from outside work and just depend on the money and the pay from the church. And he didn't do any of those things. And so Paul did not always choose to exercise those rights. We see he writes about that several times. And Paul's point, right, that the apostles have a right to material possessions is illustrated from ordinary life. He talks about this with ordinary life. And he uses a greater to lesser argument to justify the right for his allowance, right? He says, if he has supplied spiritual things, the greater, he's like, I'm supplying the greater things to you. Surely, I ought to be able to receive material benefits, which the lesser in returns. And then Paul switches it and through this and switches from a greater to lesser argument to a lesser to greater argument to support his right to a living wage, right? He says, if those who previously labored among you or received wages, then how much more should one who like basically founded the church? Right? If you used to pay some of these people, how much more should I make the one who, should I receive the one who founded this church? And in response to those who said that Paul was illegitimate because the church did not support him, there were some that did that. He declared, right, that he had yielded that right to a wage so he would not hinder the gospel of Christ. His whole, if you look at everything Paul does everything he can to prevent from hindering the gospel. And so that's what he's trying to do there. And so he talks about, right, that the Lord has commanded about, them being compensated. And some people would think that he may have been referring to Luke 10, where he said, "Among you, the gospel worker is worthy of his wage." And so that's where most people think that. But we know, and from the writings of other, like Paul told them, the point is made here that although he has the rights, he gave up the right for the gospel. He gave those things up, and so he's like, "Look, I have these rights, but I gave them up." And I gave them up so that I would not hinder the gospel. And see, I want y'all to understand that. And Paul's says there, he says, "I am compelled to preach," right? And that alludes to Paul's commission at Damascus, on the road to Damascus, that he is a chosen instrument, right? Who was given a stewardship to just to preach the message of the gospel to the nations, right? He was given that message on the road to Damascus, and so Paul had not chosen mission work as a profession; rather, God chose it for him. Basically, it's like Paul was going to destroy Christianity, and God's like, let me get you here, and so he's saying, look, that this mission was chosen for me. It's not what I would have chosen. And though Paul felt bound as Christ's servants to fulfill his commission, his obligation to preach the gospel was rewarding to him. It wasn't something that he dreaded. It wasn't like, oh, well, I got to do this because God's making me. He's like, no, I'm doing this because I am paid by seeing people brought to Christ, by those being saved. He's like, the material things is I don't need that. Right? I can take care of myself there. He says, my reward is seeing people brought to Christ. He said he took such pleasure in it that he could willingly forgo his compensation. And so Paul, as free from all, right, put forward this motive for making himself a slave, right? He said he did it in order to win more people, right? And so Paul's self-imposed slavery gave him the freedom to accommodate Jews and Gentiles alike, and therefore speak the gospel in a forthright manner, unhindered by culture hang-ups. And I like this. I think this is how we need to approach the gospel, right? To the Jews, he became a Jew. To the Gentiles, he became a Gentile. And we need to learn that, right? When we walk among certain people and when we're around certain, now, like I said earlier when I was reading this, like he didn't sin in this, right? But he became the people he was around, in the sense that he didn't hold himself above them, right? He wasn't held, I wasn't better than them. He's like, I came in, and as a Jew, I was like a Jew. And it said, just to give some examples, right? He did that with Timothy, when he had Timothy circumcised, whose mother was a Jew, to maximize the gospel witness to the Jewish area. Among the Gentiles, who were without the law, he yielded his rights, right, in order to maximize the gospel thing. So another example of that was he would not take wages, right? If he took a wage which caused those without law to stumble, right, that could have possibly hindered the message. So when he was among the Gentiles, he didn't do that. And so the phrase "not without God's law, but under the law of Christ" refers to Paul as one who had the right under God's law to receive a wage, yet among Gentiles yielded it. And so he's like, I didn't have to do this, or I could have, but I didn't. And again, that's so I could win some. And so to illustrate how serious the Corinthians must take the discipleship of their salvation, Paul then transitions, right? So he talks about that. He talks about the freedoms he had. And he talks about how I could have taken wages. I could have taken money. I had the right to. I had the right to do these other things, right? I had the right to not have to work. I had the right to take a wife. He's like, I wanted to dedicate myself to the work of the Lord, and so I didn't do these things so that it wouldn't hinder the gospel. And then he goes into to show how serious he is about what he's doing, and about how serious they need to be about what they're doing. He uses the games, right? That in Greece, it's what we get our Olympics from. And it was the competitions and games that they had every 2 years. It's the athletic competitions, and all these athletes are disciplined. We see it, right? We see we have a version of the Olympics every 2 years. We have summer and then winter, right? And we see how disciplined those Olympians are, right? They they discipline themselves. They work at this their whole life from childhood up to get to the Olympics. And so all of them, right? They have this strict discipline that's required in order for them to win. And so Paul uses this as an analogy for himself. In Paul's day, right, these athletes endure months of rigorous training before competing. We see it. It's years of training, and in the same way, we need to have strict self discipline is required. We need to have that for a person to gain the eternal prize of salvation. That's what he's saying. Like, well, this is not some flippant thing where you just kind of go through the motions a little bit, because he talks about that. He's like, I'm not. He says, I'm not shadow boxing. When someone's shadow boxing, they're just what? They're punching a shadow, and and basically they're just going through the motions. And unfortunately, with a lot of Christianity, we see that, right? And Paul's saying no, right? If you're just shadow boxing, if you're just going through the motions, then you need to be really, really careful, because Christians must engage in a real contest of obedience to Christ, right? It's true obedience rather than merely just going through the motions. If you're just checking boxes, man, you need to take a look in the mirror. We've got to be careful not to get in that. I do this, because even myself, you got to be careful not to get caught up in just checking boxes and, I got to do this, I got to do this, I got to do this. He's saying no, you truly need to be disciplined in what you're doing. And so he says like, I fear that I myself might be disqualified, right? Those who are disqualified from a sporting event have no hope of winning the prize. So when he says I myself may be disqualified, he's saying that I might lose and not end up I say lose salvation, but I may not end up in heaven, right? Because if I'm not disciplined, if I could, he says to avoid losing the eternal prize that I've been preaching out, Paul disciplines himself severely like an athlete so that he would not be led away from Christ and into a life of sin. And we're all, if Paul is tempted by that, or if Paul could do that, then any one of us could do that. And so we have to make sure that we are disciplined in our Christian walk, in our practices, and that includes reading the Bible, talking to God, being among other Christians, right? Fellowshipping with other Christians, but doing that daily, right? This is a lifelong, daily thing that we have to be prepared for. And so just to kind of summarize all this, one, Paul's like, look, I have all these rights. I had all these rights. I could do these things. These are the things I had right as an apostle to do. But I'm not doing them. And I'm not doing them for the sake of the gospel, right? Because to the Jews, I want to become a Jew. To the Gentiles, I want to be a Gentile. He's like, I want to help anyone I can, right? I want to share in their weaknesses. I want to be there for them anyway. He's like, I'm not putting myself above anyone. I'm down here, right? I'm down here in the mud and the dirt, fighting with them, and that's what he talks about there. And then he talks about the fact that, hey, it's, to me, it's not a coincidence that he talks about that kind of stuff, and then transitions to look. But I have to I have to condition myself spiritually, like daily. It's not I do this once a week. I have to daily do that so like I can be prepared so that I don't end up in the end being disqualified from going to heaven and we're getting rewarded with the eternal reward. And so we need to make sure we take very careful thought to this, right? Look at this, examine it, go back through and read it, understand it, pray around it, and get an understanding of what Paul talks about here and what he's calling us as Christians, what our Christianity should look like. Again, he's speaking to the arrogance of them, right? Their knowledge, their things, they thought they were, and even to this point, they almost in a sense thought they were better than Paul, or thought that Paul wasn't a real apostle because he wasn't taking any of their rights. It's like, no, I could do it. I'm choosing not to. And so y'all need to understand that. And so I hope this helps. I hope you understand this and go through it, because some of this stuff, man, it's deep. It's deeper, and so when we start reading through it and we see it in a 27 verse thing, you could take this whole thing and probably split it into 4 or 5 lessons, but we just don't have the time to do that. So take the time to go through this and study it, understand it. If you have any questions, comments, thoughts, put them in there, put them in the comments section. You can reach out to us, and we can have conversations around them. I love it. I love deep conversations around this type of stuff, and so more than welcome that. But as always, I appreciate everyone who takes the time to watch this, and I hope y'all have a wonderful day.